Welcome everyone, and let me introduce the session and our two distinguished guests before we start the actual chat. So this session is about what works in education, how to promote evidence-informed teaching and learning. And our two guests are Professor Becky Francis, first of all, who is the CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation, a charity that was founded in 2011, I think, but has become very well known in just a couple of years, I think, to support schools in using evidence to inform their work, particularly to improve outcomes of 11 to 24-year-olds from disadvantaged backgrounds. And when I was still working in London at UCL, I've heard many schools talking about the Pupil Premium Toolkit, how that has really supported them in kind of accessing quick evidence guides on effective interventions as a way to think about how to improve teaching and learning in the school. And that example and that work is recognized both nationally and internationally, and more recently also with the funding of a national tutoring program in England to repair learning loss of those who didn't have access to a remote or online learning in the last lockdown, but now also in the current closure of schools. And then our second guest is Professor Inge de Wolf, who I've also known for quite a long time, who combines her work at the Dutch Inspectorate of Education with a chair at Maastricht University. And she's recently founded Education Lab Netherlands, which aims to improve education through scientific evidence and also hopes to bridge the gap between research and practice, focusing on 4 areas of work: educational quality and equity, school assessment and evaluation, school quality, and artificial intelligence. And they've already established quite a large network with school boards and municipalities to work with, using randomized impact evaluations, big data analysis, and policy simulations to improve quality and effectiveness of educational policies, programs, and interventions. And I think, Inge, you're probably inspired by the What Works centers that you also came across when you did your visiting scholarship at Stanford University. So be interested to hear some of your reflections on how those centers work and how that has maybe inspired your work as well. But let's start with the kind of big question for this session, which is what works in education and how to promote evidence-informed teaching and learning, and to ask you to reflect on that and how your organization is trying to ensure evidence-informed teaching and learning. Maybe Becky, I can start with you.
Thanks so much, Melanie, and Inge, good to meet you as well. And thanks to everyone for coming. I hear you've had a really stimulating morning, but so keeping up with the digital mode of working, it can be intense. So lovely to see you all here. In terms of the Education Endowment Foundation's model and the way that we approach, we take, I guess, 2 key approaches: generation of knowledge and then mobilization of that knowledge. And in terms of the generation, the EEF in its first decade really populated a field in the UK because experimental methods and randomized controlled trials were almost unheard of in terms of academic and other forms of research. You know, what experimental research was referenced was usually drawn from the United States and so forth. But this insistence on trials very much reflecting the What Works centres, and we are a What Works centre for education in the UK. Really, I think, generated new thinking about practical knowledge for education practitioners and policymakers. And also, of course, as I say, stimulated this kind of methodological impetus. So our generation work both was funneled around our own research, filling in gaps in the literature and trying to answer really relevant questions for teachers and policymakers, but also synthesizing existing international rigorous education research about effective practice. And that features in our famous teaching and learning toolkit, which has been used by 2/3 of school leaders in England to inform their practice and their spending in their schools. So that's been really effective. And we're, of course, I should say, very mission driven. Ultimately, our aim is to support school improvement in state education across the board, but within that to focus particularly on narrowing the attainment gap for socially disadvantaged kids. So we're trying to hold on to both those elements there. And then in relation to sort of mobilizing the evidence that we've generated, there's our resources, which are freely available online, as well as the teaching and learning toolkit. We have guidance reports, animations, and so forth. And you can imagine they've been particularly popular within the pandemic. We work closely with policymakers of different times, both the British government, also the opposition. We're actually contracted with the UK government to provide evidence guardianship for some emergent policy programmes supporting teacher career paths and teaching quality and so forth. So that's another way that we work. We have a regional schools network of research schools that are working in a kind of hub and spokes model to support that evidence mobilisation, CPD and so forth across England. That's also a really important point of feedback for us from the profession. So working in two ways really there. And then finally, the fourth element that we have is scale up. And while we don't consider interventions and programs to be sort of silver bullets, nevertheless, learning from our trials work and from the work that we synthesize on the toolkit to then deliver these programs into the system is really important. And again, as Melanie's already mentioned, we've been able to exemplify that this year through the national tutoring program that we've taken a leading role with, and also scaling up the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which is a program for the early years, which we've double RCT'd and now moving to national provision. So sorry, that's a lot already, and I'm happy to talk more about any of those elements as we chat on, but I'll very much turn to Inge now.
Inge, do you want to explain your model?
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Really nice to meet you, Becky, but also to see all the other participants. So I'm looking forward to this fireside chat. As Melanie already said, my inspiration for Education Lab came from a stay in, I think, almost about 10 years ago in the United States at Stanford University, where I worked. And there was this, I think, really big and really growing What Works movement in education started there. And it really inspired me. And one of the things that inspired me was that kind of joint work with teachers, with school principals, with so it was really collaboration in order to improve education, and that's where the inspiration from Education Lab came from. Another example we're really looking at is Education Endowment Foundation. So that's also one of our our inspiration or a source for inspiration. And what we I think we kind of copied. We're smaller, right? And we just started not even a year ago. I'm co-founder and director of this Education Lab Netherlands, and I did the work with Tiana Popic-Boyer. So together we started this Education Lab, and I think we also emphasize as Becky said, so research and real RCTs, really evidence-based research or effect studies in education. So kind of high level, what works better to get better insights in education. We said research is important, share is also important. So dissemination of all the results and telling everybody the things we're finding. But I think there's one thing we add to that, and that's one of our other slogans is co-creation. And I think within Education Lab, and that's maybe slightly different from EVA, Education Endowment Foundation, is that we really invest in what we call proeftuinen. So kind of lab sessions with and lab days together with people, with teachers and principals and school boards and whoever, policymakers. So what we want, we do, we're very, very kind of starting group and very small. I think in this first year, we're already quite successful in order, because we got some huge grants to do further research. But I think this proeftuin or this labs is, I think, what differentiates us from, and also that we're smaller from Education Endowment Foundation. And an example for that is that we also make literature reviews. We do policy simulations, and we do also RCTs, randomized controlled trials in education. And so what we said is all projects must kind of, there's always a co-creation within the project. So there's no project that only academics can do. Because we really want to bridge the gap between academic world and the practitioners. So that's the reason we want to improve education by bridging this gap. But that means that all projects has to consist of at least people from academic world and people from schools. And if it's possible, also, for example, school inspectors or policymakers or whatever. And an example of that is that we did a study, a literature study. We collected the what works evidence on parent participation. And we started with the kind of review inspired by your reviews, Becky. What works in parent participation in education, and then we started to really proud of what we made from the academic world. And then we tested it with school principals and teachers, and they said, okay, it's very important, but what should I do tomorrow? It's not practical enough for us. So now we're working with with Eva Nijkens and Martin Boomsma. Some Dutch people might know them. And they, together, we make a real kind of more practical guidelines for schools and really also kind of co-owned or co-create by people from really from schools and from academics. So I think for us, that's also really important.
And can I ask you how you then connect that back to what you know about the research evidence? Because if they say this is not really practical, that also talks about a gap between two types of knowledge almost, the academic knowledge and what's coming out of research, and then how to connect that back to practice. Maybe Inge, you can talk about that example, and then Becky, maybe you can also share how you are trying to bridge that gap in England.
Yeah, maybe then I start with an example. I stay with the example of parent participation, for example. So yeah. Our literature review, I think that's not a difficult part to make. So if you're really a kind of specialist and you know what works literature, then it's not very difficult to make such a literature review. And one of the elements in there is it's very, very important to stay in contact with parents, especially in this period, right? This COVID-19 period. It's even more important than in normal. And it's also very effective. So all the programs that are effective have some kind of parent participation in it. So one of the main conclusions is invest in contacts with just very small contacts with parents, but also very big ones. So even partnerships, but also very small ones that really, really helps. But the discussion we had with Eva Nijkens, this school principal in Amsterdam, she said, but people especially in primary schools in the Netherlands, they don't know what to do then. So just put in there, send a text message to the parents. Yeah, that's what we do. So that's the kind of practical knowledge. Is what she helps us to make it practical and to make it possible to kind of for everyday use within the schools. So she said most of the times you think that, but you don't go far enough. So she said you have to really specify everything for teachers and school principals, and then they're going to use it. But just saying, stay in contact with parents, invest in parent, that comes from the literature. But how?
Yeah.
So then, and that also changes our methods in the literature research, because we started with kind of a kind of summary of what works and the specific elements, but now we also describe the very specific interventions to a very detailed level in other countries that really, really work.
Yeah, it's almost providing them with a detailed action script of do this, do this, do this.
Yeah.
Becky, how does that work in your context?
Yeah, thanks. I think two main modes. Actually, we have lots of different modes to try to make sure that we remain connected and relevant. And that's always a challenge. It's also a challenge to juggle kind of different agendas, but make sure that your strategic objectives and your mission focus stays absolutely central to all of that. Nevertheless, we have our research schools, as I've already said, that obviously not only do they use and apply our products in collaboration and conversation with local schools in their area, but they're also developing them, feeding them back to us, really making use of them and putting them into practice. So that's a great sounding board, and they are not backward in coming forward and telling us if things aren't working or things aren't feeling tangibly relevant in schools. And actually learning from that, we've recently been redeveloping a lot of our earlier guidance reports to try to make them in exactly the way that Inge mentions, more obviously relevant to schools, giving those tips, next steps, case studies and vignettes about effective practice and so forth, to try to bring the messages to life better. So I think we're learning all the time, and that's super important, actually. I mean, I think we'll probably come back to this in the conversation, but one of the, I think, hard balances for an organisation like ours is, as I say, maintaining that integrity of conceptual focus and mission focus, while also working collaboratively with lots of different stakeholders in those important partnerships and ensuring relevance. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but basically, to put it really bluntly, of course we want to be relevant to teachers. Of course we want to answer the pressing questions that are facing teachers in the classroom every day. And actually, we've developed a new program called Teacher Choices that seeks to directly reflect and answer those questions. But equally, many of the questions that teachers are particularly invested in having answered don't necessarily speak directly to our mission-driven program. So finding that balance and wending our way through that path and keeping everyone engaged is really important.
Yeah. Let me get to some of the questions in the chat. And the first one is by Rien Rauw. Becky, you will have met him in a session to the Dutch Ministry of Education that you did. And he's asking about scaling up. And just that I was also thinking about that question when Inge was talking about the very kind of practical scripts that schools are asking for. How do you ensure that some of the evidence that you're putting out there, or some of these kind of specific interventions that you find are effective, that you can scale that and ensure that all schools are using that or implementing that?
This is something that I've learned a lot about just in the last year since I arrived at the EF. One of the things that I'd come in with a slight kind of academic skepticism about some of this kind of silver bullet thinking that we sometimes see in the sector about quick fixes, one size fits all programs and so forth. But actually, as I've learnt and picked up from colleagues about different experiences we've had with programs that are proven to be successful from our RCT work, is that there are different headaches that I hadn't imagined, really. One is, of course, it's intuitive, really. The point about implementation and really effective implementation almost trumping the nature of the program. Not quite, but nevertheless being really important that those two things go hand in hand. And the second is about the wide spectrum we have of providers of different programs. So again, I hadn't realized really that some of our particularly effective programs might have been developed by, let's say, a handful of teachers or a handful of academics in one university. If in the case of the academics, often they're not even particularly interested or incentivized to think about how can we scale this up across the country, and they may not have the skill set to be doing that either. So a real kind of headache, I think, within the EF has been that some of our most effective programs and projects don't then have a clear route to further local or national scale up. In relation to the two things that I've been involved with this year that have gone to national scale up, the National Tutoring Programme and the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, I guess that both are brilliant examples of how the potential to work effectively with policymakers in terms of ensuring that delivery. And that's the way that I'd really love to see the EF working. You know, we have the role of proving effective approaches, and then we then have a further role in working with whether it's other organizations and philanthropic providers, or whether it's working with government to actually then secure those next steps to secure that program moving into wider practice. And I think that we have two lovely case studies now, if you like, with the work that we've done this year and through the pandemic.
Yeah, let me pick up on that a bit later as well, but I'd first like to ask Inge to respond to that question as well. Maybe using the example of parental engagement as well, if that lends itself to talking about scaling up or other approaches that you're using for it.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I agree with Rien that what we see now is that the participating schools, they are kind of informed, but you want to have all schools use the material, and that's not that easy, I think. And the current structures in education, they really try to help for this dissemination, this sharing of knowledge, but I think it's not enough. I think there are a few things that we're at least trying to do. So first one is, when Beck was talking about the silver bullets, I was thinking about maybe Eve and Education Lab and also Learn can kind of help finding these silver bullets in education and promoting them and evaluating them, and in order to improve the knowledge. We also do two other things, I think. One is we kind of calculate the cost effectiveness of various programs. For example, one of the programs that is really very well evaluated in the Netherlands is high dosage tutoring, and we see, as in the US, this is very, very effective for children. But one of the disadvantages of this program is that it's very, very expensive. It costs almost as much as a whole year of education for a child in the Netherlands. So learning more about cost effectiveness, I think we have to be careful to promote everything that has an effect. And also what, like you doing, right, Becky, that you also present the costs of certain programs. So I think we need to learn more about this cost effectiveness, and then finding the silver bullets and the most cost effective programs in education might really help. And what we also do is the kind of even broaden up the coalition. I'm not sure whether you were also referring to that, Becky, is we kind of broaden our coalitions with policymakers. And an example of that is we're doing now a very nice, setting up now a very nice experience, because one of the problems in the Netherlands is to attract high qualified teachers to low performing schools or schools with a high percentage of disadvantaged children, the low SES children. And what we're doing now is we want to experiment with that. So we kind of developing now various interventions so we can pay them more, smaller class sizes, CPD, continuous professional development for teachers. And we kind of want to randomize the interventions over schools. And what we're doing now is we try to involve the big cities in the Netherlands in order to participate, because one city now, for example, Amsterdam increases the salaries, Rotterdam invests in CPD, so they all do different things now. So we're now developing a coalition or working on a coalition where the big cities are involved in the Netherlands, and even the Ministry of Education might be involved. And then we can really randomize, and we offer, for example, that we randomize that every school gets 2 or 3 of the interventions, but one not, and then that's very easy to evaluate then the effectiveness of the various. But then you need other participants, I think, in helping not only getting the knowledge, but also ensure that it's really used in the next decades for example, more effective policy. So I think you also you don't have to stay on the or you should not stay always on the level of the school. So there might be different projects. So one is just really helping teachers and school principals in the classroom. But it's also, I think, very interesting what Eve does and Education Lab does, and also Learn does, is to kind of, to improve or to facilitate evidence-informed or evidence-based policy, whether it's on a local level or national level. And I think then the scaling is less a problem, because you have partners who are kind of used to big scale or scaling up things.
Yeah, some of the topics raised in the chat are about the relevance of implementation. I mean, what you're reflecting on is how the wider context or education system in terms of policy needs to be conducive to the success of certain interventions on the local level as well, perhaps. But how implementation of evidence or interventions that we know are effective is really key in scaling up as well. I was wondering, Becky, maybe you could talk a bit about the national tutoring program in England as well, because that, to me, is a really interesting example of how you are almost trying to change the structure of an entire education system by putting in place a structure that allows remote areas or students in remote areas to also access tutoring that was not there. So to try and scale up by ensuring provision in areas where that specific intervention was not there yet. Talk a bit about that as well.
Thank you. And just to say, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by the proposition of the project that Inge was outlining about incentivizing highly qualified new teachers to move into deprived areas and less successful schools. I mean, this has been a real challenge that we've revisited so many times in the English education system with no success. So I'm fascinated by that project and by your learning there, and look forward to hearing your results. Do keep me posted. I also want to just remark, I've seen Wim and Eric's comments in the chat and would love to come back to those questions too. But I've been asked to say a little bit about the National Tutoring Programme, or NTP for short, as we call it. So this was, I think, I say it's a great case study for us for several different reasons. One is that, of course, it draws on the very strong international research evidence on the effectiveness of one-to-one and small group tuition for pupil progress, obviously with the usual caveats that needs to be high quality, etc., etc. But it draws on that very strong evidence base that's been supplemented by some of our own RCTs and so forth as well, and then moves that into the system to support primarily disadvantaged young people. Now, the second thing that I feel very proud of about this is that, of course, it was a response to the pandemic and the crisis, the first set of school closures, and the learning loss that we've seen throughout the year. And as you know, the evidence is coming through very strongly now that those hypotheses about learning loss are sure enough playing out. So that scale up and how it's happened, I'll say a little bit about what it looks like in the UK case. So there are two key pillars to the National Tuition Programme. The main one is called Tuition Partners, where we've basically run a recruitment and commissioning process, recruiting in high quality providers that meet a set of quality criteria in relation to quality tutor qualification and subject specialism, the training that the organisation provides, their willingness and relationships to work with schools effectively, and then the basics like safeguarding and so forth. And then making sure that they are populated across England, because prior to this work, not only was the quality of tuition very patchy and often not available to disadvantaged kids, but also there were some real cold spots, particularly in the north and in some rural areas of England, where high quality tuition was very hard to come by. So the process has been really establishing that and then mobilising that choice and opportunity across England. And then the second pillar has been something called academic mentors, which is basically university graduates being paid a salary to work in schools, supporting the teacher, but providing small group tuition and catch up for particular groups of disadvantaged pupils in schools in deprived areas. So that's a smaller programme, but another evidence-based piece within the bigger national tutoring programme. And it's as Melanie knows, it's up and running. Of course, we've got the challenges now of a second period of school closures in the UK. But luckily, we've taken steps previously to ensure that much of this provision can continue online, albeit I'm sure we'll carry on in this discussion to talk about some of the challenges there as well. But nevertheless, we had almost 100,000 pupils signed up before Christmas. I think that's grown in the interim. So this is really motoring now across the English education system.
Great. There is indeed a question about the what works view and whether empirical RCTs are the only evidence or the best evidence. You already alluded to that, Becky, but I'd like to ask the question to Inge as well, given that she has also quite a lot of experience with what works and whether that is useful for schools to work with. Maybe Inge, you could reflect on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. I think especially when you compare to other countries, at least in the Netherlands, this what works movement is not very strong yet. I think there are several reasons for that. But what you see, not only in the United States, but also in the UK, one of the Becky, I think, as an example, but also in many, many other countries, that there's more research on what really, really works. And I think that I think that helps, because you've got all within the various steps to improve education, right? You need all types of research. So you really have to very good analyze what's the problem, and you can use all kind of correlation studies for that, and monitoring and everything. But I think when it comes to interventions in education, then it's very important not just to have a questionnaire or just to look around among the teachers and just conclude whether it's effective or not. And I think maybe because also evaluation is not very common in the Dutch schools, and be transparent about the results and the aims, and to make the aims smart and evaluate them, and especially evaluate them from the perspective of the children. So did the children really, really benefit from this intervention? That's not very common in the Netherlands. What we, in our coalitions with the schools, most schools are kind of eager to do that. So I think that it's, from a school's perspective, at least most teachers and school leaders and school boards we're working with, they say that's what we do all the time. Then you try something new, you just try it in one classroom, and if it works, you go to another classroom. So our experience is that there are interesting challenges, but to get schools to do RCTs is not the most difficult one. I think there's something went wrong maybe in the academic world, where I think the first people who started these RCTs, maybe they just looked at very easily but not very relevant maybe RCTs. So I think there are some examples that didn't really promote the What Works movement in the Netherlands. It might be one of the reasons, I'm not sure. But my experience is that when you build this strong coalition, and then you get people involved in doing real RCTs. But there are two things you need then, is those schools they must not only be willing to implement this and have a proper implementation of the intervention, but also that they really want to evaluate and measure the effect, not only on math and reading, for example, of the children, but for example also on social emotional well-being, so other outcome measures. But the schools must be willing to really look at the outcomes. But yeah, as I said, it's doable. That's I think the lessons of this 3/4 of a year of education, that if you really want to do that, then we managed to do it. So
but it does speak to an issue of culture in schools, but also in the system more widely, which is a topic that's also being raised by Tijana. How do you ensure buy-in for this type of approach and the use of evidence in schools, but also on a political level? How do you ensure that this is seen as something important and that needs to be promoted in schools? Maybe Becky, you can talk about that. And I guess that's then also almost our final question given the time, but Becky, maybe you could say a few words about that.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Inge. We haven't had a problem engaging schools in participating in the research. One of our famous sort of slide templates shows we have actually involved over half the schools in the country in our RCT work. And that's involved 1.6 million kids. It's an amazing collaborative effort, and I guess that keeping that engagement with schools and with teachers, via social media, by our resources online and so forth, is really fundamental to keep maintaining that goodwill. So I don't think that's too challenging, although of course in the current case of the pandemic, of course there are a huge number of challenges that we haven't talked about yet, practical challenges. Coming back to the sort of the question, I guess, about the RCTs and the way of doing things. I'm personally a great fan of mixed methods. Anyone of you who actually knows my own academic research will know that I've been engaged in the past in everything from ethnography to randomized controlled trials and large-scale quantitative methods. And I think all have their place. And they all have their limitations as well. But I do think that we need a mixture, and the EEF's role in really populating a field in relation to experimental methods in the UK context has been very important, I think. Of course, it has an appeal with policymakers because they want the quick answers. And as Inge said, they also want to know about both working at scale and large scale responses as well, rather than kind of, you know, individual or speculative responses from small-scale qualitative studies, however insightful those may be. It's important in terms of government money and spending that they have this sort of large-scale evidence as well, I think. But as I say, I think that working with the profession, we see ourselves as really, for teachers and senior leaders, providing the tools and resources rather than necessarily being directive. Of course, the professional lens is absolutely key alongside local knowledge in knowing what evidence is going to be productive, what evidence is relevant to your particular setting, and so forth. So definitely, we don't see ourselves as sort of deprofessionalizing in any way. We need to work in conjunction with a research literate and engaged high quality profession. And some of our work is, as I've said, in terms of policy, trying to support that building of expertise and high quality within the teaching profession as well. I realise that I'm talking about lots of different things. In relation to the sort of past history, I do think it's important to remember, you know, the EEF has existed, as Melanie said, for 10 years already, and it had a longer bedding in even before that in terms of the sort of movement for evidence-based practice that has had a long role and worked through different government administrations, you know, really starting in the 1990s under New Labour. So I do think that it's been a long time coming, and maybe building that momentum is important. So I think be patient. If you keep showing the productive results, hopefully in time it'll come.
Yeah, so creating that momentum for use of evidence is an important lesson to end with, I guess. And I guess the example that Inge was giving about co-creation is an important aspect of that as well. And then doing that, I guess, with leaders in the field who could share that with others as well. And Eva Nijkens, the school leader that Inge was referring to, someone who's very active in the national debate as well, and on Twitter, and able to share some of her insights through that level of engagement in social media, for example. So those working with those people can really help also in sharing the message, I guess, for how to get schools involved in research and use of evidence almost. So thank you for that. Thank you both for sharing your work with us. I've shared the links to both of your centers in the chat as well for anyone who wants to have a look at some of the background of your work and some of the examples on there.